What if everything you've been taught about religion, morality, and spiritual authority was just a projection, not of truth, but of your own unconscious? What if the Hierophant, the church, and even the savior figure weren't meant to rule you from above, but to awaken something already living inside you? In a world where dogma collapses and gurus fall, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The real Hierophant is in your psyche, and he's been whispering all along. Carl Jung didn't just see religion as belief, he saw it as instinct, a psychological necessity wired into our souls, begging for form, guidance, and ultimately, transcendence. The Tarot's fifth card, the Hierophant, captures this perfectly. He's not just a priest. He's an archetype, a spiritual bridge, a voice of conscience, and a shadow waiting to be integrated. But most people never meet him beyond the pulpit. They never question the rules they obey or the guilt they carry. That's where the awakening begins. This video is not about worshiping new idols. It's about reclaiming your inner authority. We're going deep into Jungian psychology, tarot symbolism, sacred law, and shadow work to uncover what the Hierophant truly represents. You'll walk away seeing the church differently. You'll see yourself differently. And if you're ready, you'll begin to hear a voice you forgot you had, the one that's been guiding you long before any religion gave a name. Chapter 1. The Archetype of the Hierophant in Tarot. The Hierophant, as the fifth card in the Tarot, doesn't walk into your psyche quietly. He enters like a patriarch with purpose, draped in sacred symbolism. He sits at the intersection of heaven and earth, acting as a bridge between mysticism and religious institution. This isn't just a man in a robe. It's the personification of spiritual authority anchored in ancient rites. For the first time in the Major Arcana, we meet a fully human-sized figure, emphasizing how archetypes aren't floating concepts. They show up in your life as real people, real moments, real decisions. He's the priest, the guru, the mentor who reminds you there's more to this world than what you see. His throne isn't just a seat. It's a declaration of divine connection. Think of him as the living embodiment of sacred law, interpreting what comes from above and channeling it into structure down below. In modern terms, he could be your therapist, your teacher, or that old man at the corner cafe who drops one sentence that changes your life. There's a reason this card stands for the logos, the divine order, the principle that makes things make sense. And just like in Jungian psychology, where the Animus represents the inner guide in women, the Hierophant becomes a spiritual compass in both genders, pointing not north, but upward. Now here's the twist. The Hierophant's authority isn't about domination. It's about transmission. He doesn't claim to be God. He speaks on behalf of the sacred. And yet, how often do we project our need for salvation onto these figures? Carl Jung knew this all too well. We hand our power over to the archetype, hoping it'll save us from our own shadow. That's why this card is so critical. It invites you to reclaim the divine within. When someone external seems to hold all the answers, maybe it's time to ask if that voice is actually coming from deep inside you. This bridge between psyche and spirit is where things get mystical. The Hierophant is the middleman between heaven and humanity, tradition and transcendence, logos and chaos. He asks you to listen for the inner voice buried beneath ego noise. Whether through ritual, meditation, or even silence, he nudges you toward the sacred without ever forcing you through the door. Just like a wise guide, he reminds you that the key has always been in your pocket. He just points to where you dropped it. And if you're wondering why this matters now, in a world drowning in digital opinions and fractured beliefs, it's because we're starved for meaning. The Hierophant emerges when your soul is craving structure that doesn't imprison. He becomes the archetype of sacred wisdom in a time of spiritual amnesia. But as with every light, a shadow follows. and that shadow is where our journey heads next. Chapter 2. Symbolism of the number 5. The number 5 isn't just an odd number in the middle of a sequence. It's the first true disruption, the one that breaks symmetry. In the tarot, it holds that same tension. It's the number of the Hierophant, and for good reason. It represents humanity in its full complexity, not divine perfection, not raw materiality, but the messy, glorious fusion of both. With 5 fingers, 5 senses, and a 5-pointed star within us, we stand at the crossroads of earth and spirit. The pentagram becomes our personal symbol of this paradox. 1 foot in the soil, 1 hand reaching for the divine. But let's not pretend the pentagram is just spiritual fluff. Across cultures, it's been a symbol of both sacred protection and feared sorcery. A perfect metaphor for the duality within us. At its best, it channels sacred law, like the Hierophant decoding divine order. At its worst, it becomes a symbol of control and illusion. Think of humanity's history. We've used the same instincts to build cathedrals and start inquisitions. 5 is that dangerous freedom, the choice to rise or fall, to project or integrate, to seek salvation or manipulate it. In Jungian terms, 5 is where individuation gets real. It's not enough to chase wholeness in theory. You've got to embody it. You'll feel it when your inner voice whispers through chaos. That moment when your ego wants to lash out, but you pause and listen to something higher. That's the 5 at work. The synthesis of instincts, intellect, spirit, and emotion converging in consciousness. The Hierophant becomes the guide here, not with rules, but with resonance. He doesn't say obey. He says understand. Let's take a practical look. When you're stuck in a moral dilemma, maybe you're torn between following a belief or honoring your intuition. You're in the domain of the 5. You're confronting your pentagram. Head, arms, legs, heart. That's the shape Da Vinci drew, the human body aligned with universal order. Try sketching that symbol and journaling around it. What part of you is leading right now? What's out of balance? This simple act can reconnect you to that ancient, sacred geometry that lives in your own skin. So, when 5 shows up in your life, as conflict, doubt, or breakthrough, don't run from it. It's not here to break you. It's here to test if you're ready to integrate all that you are. The Hierophant knows this. He sits calmly with that knowledge, waiting for you to notice the cosmic riddle carved into your own shape. But as we'll soon see, this path toward meaning has deeper roots in the very instincts of the human psyche. Chapter 3. Jungian interpretation of the religious impulse. Carl Jung didn't see religion as a neurosis to be cured. He saw it as a need of the soul, a compass planted deep in the subconscious. Unlike Freud, who reduced religion to wishful thinking and repressed desire, Jung believed the religious instinct was autonomous, just like hunger or sex. It wasn't about believing in a man in the sky. It was about connecting to the numinous, that mysterious force that stirs awe and demands reverence. The Hierophant, in this view, is less a preacher and more a mirror, reflecting the psyche's yearning for spiritual wholeness. When people kneel before a religious figure, they're often kneeling before their own anima or animus, projected outward in robes and ritual. That's the catch. Projection is part of the path. We need that figure to begin the journey, because the ego can't bear to look directly at the infinite. The Hierophant steps in as a safe container, a sacred stand-in for something too vast to name. Over time, that outer figure becomes a portal inward, guiding the psyche toward integration with a higher self, the logos encoded in our bones. It's why even the most rebellious souls often feel a pull toward mysticism. They're not running from religion. They're running from institutions. But the instinct remains. Think of how many people today seek meaning in astrology, tarot, psychedelics, or even breathwork retreats. They're trying to feed the same impulse, just without the architecture of a church. The Hierophant archetype persists. It just wears different clothes. It's your inner call to order the chaos, to find meaning in the madness. Jung warned that if we ignore this instinct, it doesn't disappear, it festers. That's when we start worshiping false gods, success, fame, ideology, even technology. We bow to whatever seems to offer salvation. But without inner ritual, we become spiritually starved. One simple practice: light a candle, pull a card, sit in silence for 5 minutes. No dogma, no guilt, just you and your psyche, reconnecting through sacred symbolism. It may feel small, but the Hierophant would tell you that's where it starts. And the beauty of this journey is that it doesn't end in blind obedience. It evolves into spiritual discernment. The Hierophant invites you to meet the divine on your own terms. But before you can meet God face to face, you've got to wrestle with your own projections. And that's where we're headed next. Chapter 4: Projection and Psychological Development. Projection is one of the psyche's oldest tricks, and one of its most sacred. Before we can see something inside us, we almost always have to see it out there first. That's why we fall in love with teachers, idolize gurus, and fear leaders. We project our own unclaimed power, our divine connection, onto someone who looks like they got it all figured out. The Hierophant, as a tarot archetype, embodies this exact function. The spiritual father onto whom we pin our deepest longings and unspoken truths. But here's where things get interesting. Jung teaches that what we project is never random. It's precisely what we have the potential to integrate. When someone inspires awe, chances are they're mirroring a part of your soul you've yet to embody. The Hierophant's role, then, is not to hold on to that projection forever, but to become transparent enough that you eventually see yourself through him. That's the bridge between ego and self, between blind obedience and conscious individuation. Think about a time you put someone on a pedestal, maybe a mentor, a partner, or even a celebrity. Now ask, what quality did they seem to possess that felt out of reach for you? Was it wisdom, calm, conviction? That's your Hierophant. Your psyche is saying, this belongs to you too. Claim it. One powerful exercise: list 3 people you deeply admire and identify what you envy or idealize in them. Those are clues. The archetype is alive in you. It's just waiting to be invited home. Projection isn't bad. It's a stage. It's like training wheels for the soul. But if we don't move past it, we remain spiritually dependent, always looking outward for validation. The Hierophant's shadow becomes apparent here. When we mistake the symbol for the source, we lose ourselves in dogma. That's when we need to step back and ask, am I worshiping this figure, or the part of me they awaken? That's the key to psychological development, reclaiming the sacred within. Eventually, projection gives way to possession, not in the spooky sense, but in the empowering one. You realize that what once looked divine in others has been part of your psyche all along. The Hierophant hands you the keys, but it's your job to walk through the door. And that door, it often leads straight into the heart of history, and into the powerful institution that grew around this archetype. Chapter 5: Historical and Psychological Role of the Church. The Church didn't rise in a vacuum. It rose to meet a deep psychological need. As humanity evolved beyond tribes and oral traditions, we crave structure to handle something much bigger: moral conflict. The Hierophant, seated at the center of this sacred machinery, offered more than rituals. He offered spiritual containment. When the world felt chaotic, the Church provided sacred order, mapping the soul's longing for salvation onto stone cathedrals and incense-filled aisles. It wasn't just religion, it was architecture for the psyche. On a psychological level, the church became a surrogate parent, guiding people through existential confusion. Confession wasn't just about sin, it was about integration. People brought their shadow to light, whispered secrets behind the veil, and sought absolution through sacred law. Jung saw this as a crucial function, giving form to the inner drama of guilt, desire, and transcendence. And the Hierophant? He stood there as the bridge, not the source of grace, but the interpreter of divine justice, acting as mediator between logos and the fractured soul. Think about how institutions still serve this function today. Therapy rooms, support groups, coaching circles. We may have traded pews for podcasts, but the need remains to be seen, forgiven, and guided. In a world of endless choices and digital overload, many long for a modern Hierophant, someone to say, "You're on the right path," or "Here's what your suffering means." That hunger for sacred reflection is real, and the institutions that offer it, when done with integrity, become psychological sanctuaries. But here's where the shadow creeps in. When the church began to prioritize control over connection, dogma over direct experience, the Hierophant's archetype twisted into something else, the gatekeeper of salvation. That shift mirrored a deep psychic split, the belief that the divine is out there, far from reach, accessible only through a middleman. And as we'll see soon, that distortion births fanaticism, repression, and spiritual abuse. Yet even this dissent holds insight for our evolution. Because if the church once held the world's spiritual conscience, then the individual today must learn to hold their own. The Hierophant isn't gone. He's just gone inward. But before we can fully embrace this inner guidance, we need to face the polarities it contains, the battle between blessing and curse, light and shadow, holiness and heresy. Chapter 6. Spiritual Duality and Moral Authority. The Hierophant in the tarot isn't just a wise old man giving blessings. He's a gatekeeper of polarities. He knows that to guide humanity, you don't just hand out halos. Sometimes, you have to confront the devil within. As the interpreter of sacred law, the Hierophant embodies the tension between salvation and condemnation, illumination and ignorance. That's what makes him powerful and dangerous. He sits at the axis of duality, interpreting divine while holding the authority to name what is sacred and what is sinful. Moral authority, when wielded consciously, brings clarity and protection. But when driven by ego or fear, it casts a long shadow, judgment, exclusion, even spiritual tyranny. The Hierophant becomes the face of salvation and the enforcer of damnation. You see this echoed in every institution that claims to speak for the divine. Religious leaders who shame rather than guide. Systems that weaponize belief rather than heal. And yet, this conflict isn't out there. It's in us. Each of us carries this inner duality, the desire to do right, and the temptation to control what right even means. You might feel this when you judge yourself harshly for not meditating enough, not being spiritual enough, not living up to some sacred standard. That's your inner Hierophant being hijacked by perfectionism. A powerful exercise is to journal from two voices. One is the condemning Hierophant, and one as the forgiving Hierophant. Notice which one sounds more familiar. That inner dialogue reveals how moral authority is playing out in your psyche, and how to bring it back into balance. Carl Jung believed that true spiritual growth involves facing this inner split, the conflict between your higher self and your shadow. The Hierophant card teaches that to evolve, you must learn to bless your darkness without being devoured by it. That doesn't mean tolerating harm. It means learning to guide it, integrate it, and let it teach you. The blessing and the curse come from the same mouth, and the real challenge is learning when to speak each one and to whom. And yet, for every Hierophant that blesses, there's one that banishes. That tension between guidance and oppression leads us into deeper territory. Because if every archetype contains its opposite, then the Hierophant must also carry within him the very darkness he warns us about. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. Chapter 7. The Hierophant and the Shadow of Authority. Every great light casts a shadow, and the brighter the light, the darker the shadow it creates. The Hierophant, for all his sacred robes and divine speech, is no exception. Behind the mask of spiritual authority often lurks something far more complex: the temptation to dominate rather than guide. When the Hierophant archetype falls into shadow, it doesn't look like wisdom. It looks like tyranny disguised as truth. That's when the voice of conscience turns into the voice of control, and divine guidance becomes spiritual imprisonment. This shadow isn't exclusive to popes or priests. It lives in each of us. You probably felt it when someone weaponized morality to shame you. Maybe it was a parent, a teacher, or even your own inner critic, echoing with the language of shoulds and musts. That's the shadow Hierophant speaking, the one who clings to order so tightly that he suffocates the soul. And yet, this isn't about demonizing authority. It's about recognizing when sacred law has stopped serving evolution and started serving ego. In psychological terms, the Hierophant shadow emerges when we cling to spiritual identity instead of spiritual truth. It's the guru who manipulates followers, the influencer who preaches healing but hasn't done their own shadow work, the well-meaning friend who quotes mysticism but avoids vulnerability. Projection plays a role again here. We project perfection onto authority figures, then feel betrayed when they reveal their flaws. But the real betrayal is thinking anyone could hold the divine for us in the first place. Want to spot your own shadow Hierophant? Pay attention to the rules you impose on others in the name of truth. Notice when you feel superior for being more aware, more conscious, more spiritual. That's your inner tyrant, cloaked in virtue. One way to balance this is by integrating humility into your practice. Not false modesty, but real, grounded acknowledgement that no one holds absolute truth. The moment you stop trying to be the Hierophant, ironically, you begin to embody him with authenticity. This is where the tarot doesn't flinch. It shows us the whole picture. The Hierophant is a symbol of salvation, yes, but also a warning. Spiritual authority must always be tempered with self-awareness. And as we dig deeper into the archetype, we'll find that this shadow isn't just collective. It also shows up in our personal evolution, especially in how women relate to the Animus within. Chapter 8. The Evolution of the Animus in Women. Emma Jung, Carl's brilliant partner in both life and psyche, mapped the Animus as the inner masculine figure within a woman's unconscious. Not just a concept, but a living force. And like any living thing, it evolves. She described 4 stages of this evolution: the man of physical power, the man of action, the man of word, and finally, the man of meaning, the Hierophant. In this final form, the Animus no longer dominates or dazzles. He teaches. He guides. He helps the feminine connect to universal order without needing to submit to it. But let's be real. In a world where religious institutions often left women out of the conversation, the Hierophant archetype can feel complicated. For many women, it evokes centuries of exclusion, silencing, even excommunication. And yet, Jung's insight flips the script. The Hierophant isn't just out there. He's inside. He isn't a patriarch to be obeyed, but an inner logos to be heard. When a woman integrates this evolved Animus, she doesn't need validation from outer authority. She becomes her own bridge to the divine. This plays out in everyday life more than we realize. Think of a woman who feels the urge to speak a truth in a room full of doubt, not to dominate, but to offer meaning. Or one who follows a quiet inner calling that makes no sense to anyone else, yet feels utterly sacred. That's the inner Hierophant speaking. It's not about preaching or controlling. It's about embodying clarity, conviction, and purpose. Practices like dream journaling, meditation on the fifth tarot card, or engaging with sacred texts through a Jungian lens can awaken this voice. But the evolution of the Animus isn't always smooth. Before the Hierophant emerges, the earlier stages can bring conflict, projecting onto men, seeking meaning in external authority, confusing intellect with wisdom. That's part of the journey. Each failed projection becomes compost for inner growth. The key is not to reject the masculine, but to refine it, to invite the Hierophant not as a ruler, but as a partner in inner alchemy. And this inner work isn't just personal, it's cultural. As more women embody the Hierophant archetype, they help rewire the collective psyche. They become mystics, guides, interpreters of sacred law on their own terms. But they also signal something deeper, that society itself is shifting toward a hunger for meaning beyond power, image, or empty ritual. Chapter 9. Cultural Evolution Toward Meaning. There's a quiet revolution happening beneath the noise of modern life, a collective turning inward. As the old institutions lose their grip, people aren't just abandoning religion. They're searching for something deeper, more personal, more real. The tarot's Hierophant card taps into this exact pulse, a symbol of meaning, not control. We're living in a time where dogma feels outdated and flashy spiritual performances fall flat. What people want now is depth, substance, a direct line to the sacred that doesn't require robes or rituals to feel legitimate. In this new landscape, the Hierophant archetype isn't leading from a pulpit. He's whispering through books, dreams, synchronicities, and conversations that leave your soul buzzing. He shows up when you're scrolling late at night and stumble upon a quote that hits you like lightning. He appears when you're washing dishes and suddenly feel the urge to pray, even if you don't know who you're praying to. That's the Hierophant without the church, the sacred calling you home through the cracks of ordinary life. But this shift isn't easy. In a world obsessed with instant gratification and productivity, pausing for meaning feels radical. Try telling someone you spend an hour meditating on a tarot card and see how fast they change the subject. And yet, that's the point. Meaning doesn't need approval. It needs devotion. Want to deepen this journey? Read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning or Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul. They'll hand you the map, but the walk, that's all you. The Hierophant in this context isn't a person. He's a pattern. A psychic function that helps us make sense of chaos, grief, love, and transformation. He doesn't offer certainty, but coherence. And coherence is what we're starving for. Not answers, but alignment. That feeling when something clicks inside and you go, yes, that's it. Whether it's in a therapy session, a sacred ceremony, or a quiet moment with your journal, that flash of inner knowing is the new ritual. So the question becomes, can you hold meaning without needing to prove it? Can you live a mystical life without applause? As the collective turns toward inner guidance, the Hierophant's archetype rises, not as ruler, but as witness. And within that stillness, you'll begin to hear another voice. Not from above, not from outside, but from deep within, the quiet echo of your own inner Hierophant. Chapter 10. The Inner Hierophant and Personal Conscience. The Hierophant isn't just a figure on a throne. He lives in your chest, in that subtle voice that tells you what's right when no one's watching. This is the voice of personal conscience, a sacred function of the psyche that evolves through experience, pain, insight, and inner alignment. But here's the catch. If you don't know how to listen to it properly, that voice can turn into a tyrant. It might sound like moral clarity, but sometimes it's just internalized guilt in disguise. That's the shadow Hierophant again, dressed up as discipline. Developing a relationship with your inner Hierophant takes more than meditation. It takes radical honesty. You've got to question whether that inner voice is guiding you toward wholeness or shaming you into obedience. One simple way to tell: check how your body feels when the voice speaks. If it expands you, opens your chest, grounds you in peace, that's guidance. If it contracts you, fills you with dread or shame, that's projection. Spiritual discernment isn't woo-woo. It's a survival skill in an age of moral confusion. Think of how often we outsource this voice. We look to gurus, algorithms, institutions to tell us what's right. But real authority begins when you stop asking for permission and start asking deeper questions. What resonates with my soul? What would integrity look like here? You might try keeping a moral clarity journal. Each night, jot down one moment where you followed your conscience and one where you ignored it. Patterns will emerge, and so will your Hierophant. But beware, just as the Hierophant can offer divine counsel, he can also become a manipulator if your ego gets too cozy with the idea of being right. That's when conscience turns into self-righteousness. Jung knew this all too well. The ego loves to play dress-up, and spiritual authority is one of its favorite costumes. The challenge is to hold your moral compass gently, like a flame in the wind, not as a sword to punish others, but as a light to walk your own path with courage. And if you've walked far enough with this inner guide, you'll start noticing something beautiful. You become a translator of invisible truths, not just for yourself, but for others. That's when the archetype deepens, and the Hierophant becomes more than an inner voice. He becomes a bridge, linking personal conscience to collective wisdom. Chapter 11. The Hierophant as bridge between worlds. The word pontiff literally means bridge builder, and that's exactly what the Hierophant archetype does best. He spans two worlds, the sacred and the secular, the invisible and the visible, the ancient and the now. In tarot, he's not just a spiritual figure sitting pretty on a throne. He's the living link between the mystical and the human, translating divine frequencies into human language. Like a spiritual interpreter, he listens to the logos and speaks it in words your heart can actually understand. We all need that bridge at some point. When life throws a curveball, a death, a breakup, a sudden awakening, the soul cries out for structure. The Hierophant steps in not to fix, but to reframe. He helps you see that your suffering isn't random. It's part of a symbolic order. That moment when a book finds you at the perfect time, or someone says the exact thing your soul needed. That's the Hierophant archetype doing his silent work, translating chaos into meaning without needing a pulpit. The bridge he builds isn't one way either. He also brings your personal insights back to the collective. Think of writers, artists, therapists, or even content creators who channel their inner world and offer it to others. That's the Hierophant in jeans and Wi-Fi, making sacred wisdom accessible without watering it down. If you've ever felt called to share your story, to speak truth into confusion, or to create something that helps others feel less alone, you've already crossed that bridge. But here's the tension. The bridge can crack when dogma replaces dialogue. When tradition becomes a cage instead of a compass, the Hierophant archetype distorts. That's when people turn away from spirituality altogether, mistaking the fall of institutions for the death of meaning. In truth, it's just the old bridge collapsing, so a new, more authentic one can rise from within each of us. One that honors both personal conscience and universal order. And as that inner Hierophant awakens and begins to speak, something ancient stirs. a deeper archetype hidden within the folds of spiritual history, one that carries not just moral clarity, but the power of redemption itself. Because at his most exalted form, the Hierophant mirrors something even greater than the bridge, the figure of the Savior. Chapter 12. The Hierophant and the Archetype of the Savior. When the Hierophant archetype ascends to its highest vibration, he begins to resemble the Savior, not in a literal, messianic sense, but as a living channel for grace, forgiveness, and moral rebirth. In the Tarot, this isn't about creating a new religion or building cathedrals. It's about awakening the Christ within. Just as Jung saw figures like Job confronting the divine and reshaping human consciousness in the process, the Hierophant evolves into a vessel of transformation, a mirror through which the soul recognizes its potential for salvation. But don't be fooled. This isn't about perfection. The Savior energy carried by the Hierophant is forged in the fire of suffering. He knows what it's like to lose faith, to question the order of things, to wrestle with the logos. That's why he doesn't just offer absolution. He embodies it. He doesn't just say, "You're forgiven." He lives the process of forgiveness, within himself and in the presence of others. In therapy, this may look like holding space for someone's shame without flinching. In daily life, it could be as simple as choosing compassion when anger would be easier. Think of someone in your life who offered you a kind word when you least deserved it. That was the Hierophant in Savior mode. Or reflect on a time you forgave yourself for a mistake that haunted you. That was you channeling this archetype from within. This is where mysticism and psychology dance together. The Savior isn't some unreachable ideal. It's a psychic blueprint that activates when you become radically human and unshakably loving at the same time. Of course, this role isn't without danger. The line between the Savior and the martyr can blur fast. The Hierophant must know when to guide and when to step back, when to offer redemption and when to let someone walk their own path. Without that discernment, he becomes the enabler or the egotist. That's why deep inner work is essential. Shadow integration, humility practices, and rituals of grounding keep the archetypes sacred rather than inflated. And so, the Hierophant completes his arc, from outer authority to inner conscience, from projection to presence, from bridge builder to savior. But this isn't the end, because now the question turns back to you. What does it mean to carry this archetype in your own life? And more importantly, what are you going to do with it? Conclusion. Are you still waiting for someone outside you to give permission for what your soul already knows? So now you know, the Hierophant isn't just a figure in robes or a card in a deck. He's a living, breathing archetype etched into your psyche, speaking through your dreams, your conscience, and your quiet moments of inner knowing. He bridges your chaos with cosmic order, not by demanding obedience, but by guiding you toward meaning. The question is, are you really listening? Or are you still waiting for someone outside you to give permission for what your soul already knows? What would your life look like if you trusted your inner Hierophant? If you stopped outsourcing your spiritual compass to institutions, influencers, or fear? What conversations would you have? What truths would you speak? This isn't about rebelling against tradition. It's about stepping into your sacred role as the interpreter of your own divine experience. And it starts with one courageous act, recognizing that your search for guidance has always been a search for yourself. So here's your invitation. Apply what you've learned. Journal, meditate, observe your projections, confront your shadow. Begin building that bridge between your highest wisdom and your everyday life. And if this message stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment below. Which version of the Hierophant have you been carrying? The tyrant or the guide? And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, because this is just the beginning of the journey. There's so much more to awaken.